It all started innocuously enough, or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. Jason, my husband of 8 years, had always been full of surprises, but nothing prepared me for what he casually brought up one evening over dinner. The candles flickered softly on the table between us, casting warm shadows as we talked about the mundane details of our day, work, errands, and life. It was just like any other evening until Jason leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine, and said, "You know, there's something I've been thinking about lately, something I'd like to explore with you." His words were slow, measured, but there was an undeniable tension behind them, a hint of nervousness that piqued my curiosity. "What is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He hesitated, glancing away for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, his gaze locked on mine, and the intensity in his eyes caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about you with someone else." For a moment, I didn't comprehend what he meant. The words hung between us like a foreign concept I couldn't quite grasp. "With someone else?" I repeated, confused. He nodded, his lips twitching into a small, almost sheepish smile. "I mean, with Andrew, my best friend." The mention of Andrew, our closest friend, sent a shockwave through me. I knew Andrew well. He had been part of our lives for years, a fixture at holidays and barbecues. But I had never thought of him in that way. Jason's suggestion, however, lingered in the air, stirring something deep inside me that I hadn't expected. My pulse quickened as I processed his words, the implications becoming clear. "Jason, are you serious?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his hand reaching across the table to cover mine. "I know it sounds unconventional, but I trust you, and I trust him. I've just been thinking about it for a while, and I wanted to see if it was something you might consider." No pressure. I sat back, my mind racing. The idea of being with Andrew felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I had never seen him as anything more than Jason's friend. But now, with the seed planted, my thoughts spiraled in directions I hadn't allowed myself to go before. I couldn't deny the flicker of curiosity, the tiny spark of excitement that Jason's suggestion had ignited. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Jason had suggested. It wasn't just the idea of being with someone else, it was the fact that he wanted it. His openness about it, his confidence, made the concept even more difficult to push aside. I found myself watching Jason closely, trying to decipher if there was something deeper behind his request. Was this just a fantasy of his, or was he pushing me toward something I hadn't realized I wanted? And then there was Andrew. We had always had a comfortable friendship. He was charming in his quiet way, with that easy smile and warm laugh that made him approachable. I couldn't deny that there had been moments, small, fleeting moments, when I had noticed the way he moved, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on me a little longer than they should have. I had always brushed those thoughts away, assuming they were just harmless, meaningless observations. But now, with Jason's words still echoing in my mind, I started to wonder if there had always been something more lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the opportunity presented itself. Jason invited Andrew over for drinks one Friday night. The three of us had done this a dozen times before, sitting around the living room, sipping wine, laughing, and reminiscing. But this time, there was a charged atmosphere that I couldn't ignore. I was hyper-aware of Andrew's presence, of the way he leaned back casually on the couch, his arm draped along the backrest just behind me. The conversation flowed easily, but I found myself stealing glances at him, small, lingering glances I hadn't allowed myself before. His profile, the way his fingers curled around his glass, the warmth in his eyes as he spoke. Every detail seemed sharper, more noticeable, and I could feel the tension building inside me with every passing minute. Jason was watching, too. I could feel his eyes on me, though he said nothing. The unspoken understanding between us added to the mounting pressure. I shifted in my seat, suddenly aware of how close I was to Andrew. My heart raced as his knee brushed against mine, a casual, accidental touch that sent a ripple through my body. He didn't move away, and neither did I. The night wore on, and I found myself laughing more, leaning in closer as the conversation deepened. Jason excused himself at one point to get more wine, leaving Andrew and me alone for the first time that evening. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. I felt his eyes on me, and when I finally turned to meet his gaze, there was something there, something I hadn't seen before. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and gentle. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." He studied me for a moment, his gaze searching. "About what?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. How could I explain what was happening without ruining the delicate balance between us? But before I could find an answer, Jason returned, breaking the moment. He handed me a glass of wine, his eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but the tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. When Andrew finally stood to leave, I found myself lingering at the door with him, Jason standing just a few feet away. There was a charged silence between us as Andrew glanced back at me, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night," he said softly, his voice filled with something that made my pulse race. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Good night." As the door closed behind him, I turned to Jason, my heart still pounding in my chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes that told me he had noticed everything. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but there was a teasing edge to it. I took a deep breath, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the confusion and excitement swirling inside me. Jason stepped closer, his hand reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from my face. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice steady and calm. "You don't have to decide anything right now." I nodded, but the tension between us lingered, unresolved and electric. The following days were a blur of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. Jason's calm demeanor and his complete acceptance of what he had suggested only added to my internal conflict. I kept replaying the night Andrew had visited, how Jason had watched, how Andrew's gaze had lingered on me at the door. It had been subtle, but the tension between us had been real, undeniable. Jason didn't bring it up again, not directly at least. But there were moments, small, fleeting ones, when his eyes would meet mine with that same glint, as if he knew I was still thinking about it. And I was. More than I wanted to admit. One evening, about a week after Andrew's visit, Jason finally broached the topic again. We were lying in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of the moonlight through the curtains. I had been quiet all night, lost in thought, when he gently reached over, his fingers brushing my arm. "You've been distant lately," he said softly. I turned to face him, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on my chest. "It's just a lot to think about." He nodded, his expression understanding. "I know. And I don't want you to feel pressured. If you're uncomfortable, we can forget about it." But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that I wasn't sure I wanted to forget about it. The idea of being with Andrew, of exploring this strange, forbidden attraction, had taken root in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. "It's not that," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Jason propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Then what is it?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "It's just, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about it. I never thought I'd be in this situation. And Andrew, he's your best friend?" Jason was quiet for a moment, his hand gently resting on mine. "I trust him. And I trust you." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my heart flutter. Jason had always been open-minded, but this level of trust, this level of vulnerability, was something entirely different. It was as if he was giving me permission to explore a part of myself I hadn't even realized existed. "I don't know if I can go through with it," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. Jason leaned closer, his lips brushing my forehead. "You don't have to," he whispered. "But if you want to, if you're curious, we'll figure out together. No pressure. No expectations." His reassurance settled some of the anxiety in my chest, but it didn't erase the curiosity that had been growing inside me. I had never considered being with anyone else, let alone someone like Andrew. But now, With Jason's support, the idea seemed less terrifying and more possible. Days passed, and the tension between us grew. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind, but rather the kind that buzzed just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. And then, one evening, Jason invited Andrew over again. I knew what this meant. The unspoken agreement was there, hovering in the air as Jason handed me a glass of wine and smiled, that same reassuring smile he had given me the last time. Andrew arrived shortly after, and from the moment he walked through the door, I could feel the tension between us all. We settled into the living room, just as we always had, but this time, everything felt different. My heart raced as I sat between Jason and Andrew, the wine loosening the tightness in my chest, but doing nothing to calm the excitement that thrummed through my veins. Conversation flowed easily, but my mind was elsewhere, hyper-aware of every movement, every glance, every subtle touch. At one point, Jason casually rested his hand on my knee, his fingers tracing small circles that sent shivers up my spine. I glanced over at Andrew, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was something unspoken in that glance, something that made my pulse quicken. As the night wore on, Jason excused himself to grab something from the kitchen, leaving me alone with Andrew. The air between us was thick, heavy with tension that had been building for weeks. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I finally turned to face him, the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with something more. Concern, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. I nodded, though my heart was pounding. "Yeah, I'm fine." There was a pause, and in that moment, the room seemed to shrink around us. Andrew shifted slightly, his knee brushing against mine again, and this time, neither of us pulled away. The subtle touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I couldn't stop the way my breath hitched. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to where our knees were touching. "Neither did I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Another silence stretched between us, thick and palpable. I could feel the tension coiling tighter and tighter, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand lightly brushing his arm. The contact was innocent enough, but the spark it ignited was anything but. Andrew glanced down at my hand, then back up at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, we just sat there, the air between us crackling with unspoken desire. And then, before I could think better of it, I leaned in. As I leaned in, the world seemed to slow down, the space between us shrinking until there was nothing left but the tension that had been building for what felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears as I moved closer, hesitating for just a moment before our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, soft and almost unsure, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this new reality. But the second our lips touched, a rush of heat flooded through me, and I couldn't pull away. The kiss deepened, his hand moving to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as the weight of everything we had been denying crashed over us. I heard a faint noise, and suddenly I remembered Jason. I pulled back, breathless and flushed, glancing toward the kitchen, expecting him to reappear at any moment. But the room remained still, the sound fading into the background. Andrew and I locked eyes, both of us breathing hard, caught in the aftermath of the kiss we'd just shared. "This is wrong," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. Andrew swallowed hard, his hand still lingering on my arm. "I know," he murmured, his voice rough with the same conflict I felt. But I knew what he was going to say. The "but" hung in the air, unspoken yet fully understood. There was something between us, something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to surface. And now that it had, there was no going back. Jason stepped into the room just then, his presence startling us both. For a split second, I froze, my heart racing with guilt and confusion. But Jason didn't seem surprised. In fact, the look in his eyes told me he had expected this, had maybe even wanted this. He approached us slowly, his gaze flicking between Andrew and me. "You don't have to stop," he said, his voice calm and steady, as if he was giving us permission to continue. I stared at him, my mind spinning. This was what he wanted. He had planted the seed, given me the freedom to explore something I hadn't even known I wanted. And now, standing there, watching the two of us, he was telling me it was okay to take that step.
To cross that line.
I turned back to Andrew, my chest tight with emotion. His eyes searched mine, silently asking me what I wanted to do. And the truth was, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to stop, to go back to the way things had been, to preserve the boundaries that had once kept us safe. But another part of me, the part that had felt the thrill of his touch, the heat of his kiss, couldn't deny the desire that still burned inside me. Jason came closer, sitting beside me on the couch. His hand gently brushed my back, and I felt his calm presence steadying me, grounding me. "I trust you," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet assurance that made my heart ache. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." The room was thick with emotion, with the weight of the decision I had to make. I glanced between Jason and Andrew, my thoughts swirling with guilt, desire, and confusion. This was a moment of truth, and I knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us as I weighed my options. And then, slowly, I reached for Andrew's hand. His fingers curled around mine, warm and familiar, and in that moment, I made my decision. I leaned into him again, our lips meeting in a kiss that was no longer tentative. This time, it was filled with all the unspoken emotions we had kept hidden, the desire that had simmered beneath the surface for so long. Andrew responded immediately, his hand slipping to my waist as he pulled me closer, the tension between us finally breaking. Jason watched, his expression unreadable, but there was no anger or jealousy in his eyes, only a quiet acceptance. He had wanted this, and now he was giving me the freedom to explore it. The kiss deepened, and I felt the last of my reservations melt away. Andrew's touch was firm, confident, and I let myself get lost in the moment, in the heat of his hands and the taste of his lips. It was exhilarating, overwhelming, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. But then, just as quickly as it had started, reality crashed back in. I pulled away from Andrew, my chest heaving with the weight of everything that had just happened. My eyes darted to Jason, and the guilt I had tried to ignore settled heavily in my stomach. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't do this." Andrew's face fell, and I saw the disappointment in his eyes. But he nodded, understanding. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I turned to Jason, tears welling in my eyes. "I love you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to hurt you." Jason's hand found mine, squeezing it gently. "You haven't hurt me," he reassured me. "I just wanted you to have the choice. I wanted you to feel free." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I leaned into Jason's embrace, the weight of the moment crashing over me. I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, but I hadn't lost myself. And somehow, through it all, I knew Jason still loved me, still trusted me. Andrew stood up slowly, his expression sad but resigned. "I should go," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry if I made this harder for you." I looked up at him, my heart aching for what could never be. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "This was all complicated." Andrew gave a small, sad smile before turning and walking out the door. The silence that followed was deafening, but Jason's arms around me anchored me, reminding me that, no matter what, we were in this together. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, I was grateful for the love and trust that had gotten us through this moment. There were no easy answers, no clear resolution, but somehow we had navigated the storm and found our way back to each other. And that, for now, was enough.